Hi, everybody. So this is my third attempt to record this lecture on the Romantics in England. Wish me luck. I got the kids down for naps, so it shouldn't be too hard to do. And I got to just really keep an eye on the time because if it goes just a second over 15 minutes, I'm in trouble. Okay, so I want to talk about the history of poetry. And I thought that it would be a good idea to start with the English Romantics. Why? Well, I'm really reminded of the importance of the Romantic movement when I look at something like Simbat's great presentations about Kazakhstani literature and about literature in Kazakh. And I was thinking about this metaphor of the Oryol and Reshka. Yeah, so you guys all know the TV show Oryol and Reshka, and it's a kind of nice metaphor for the constant interaction in the history of poetry between what you might call more and less prestigious languages and cultures. And it can help us to understand why a good place to start studying the history of poetry might be with the European Romantic movement, because it's kind of a model for what will happen or what is happening in terms of building literary and poetic culture here in Kazakhstan. So, as you know, we started with the history of writing. We talked a little bit about that in some of the previous screencasts. And we looked at the Roman Empire, for example, as an empire of literacy, an empire of reading and writing, an educational empire. And we talked about how for many, many centuries in the Western tradition, it was really Rome and Roman literature and education that provided the model for all subsequent education. This was what you might call an Oryol culture, by comparison with which English or German or the Slavic languages would be considered Reshka cultures. Now, that began to change in the Romantic era in a way that I think is really significant for Kazakhstan, and I'm going to see if I can explain why. Let's just take the sonnet as an example. If you look at Petrarch, who was writing around the year 1400 or in the 14th century, what he would have taken as his model in literature would have been the classical Romans from about 1,000 years before. The whole idea behind the Renaissance was that they were trying to bring back that classical culture that had fallen away. So Petrarch was somebody who saw himself as being in a Reshka culture and who was modeling a poetic poets and poetry from an Oryol culture of Italy 1,000 years before. Well, by the time Shakespeare comes along, it's now Petrarch's work is in the Reshka culture and it's become the model. And Shakespeare, who's coming from a developing language, English namely, is looking to people like Petrarch for his models. Likewise, another couple hundred years down the line, as Russia begins to catch up with the West culturally, it looks to models like Shakespeare and the Oryol culture, and so on and so forth. So if you think about Kazakhstan as a country that is developing its literature and its poetry, of course, it's going to look to poets like Pushkin or Shakespeare or Petrarch, who are now in what you might call the prestige or Oryol culture in poetry. Okay, so why does this relate to the Romantics? Because the Romantics, the writers of the Romantic period, were really the first in the history of Western literacy to give modern literature an equal status with ancient Greek and Roman literature. This went hand in hand with the rise of nationalism. So the idea of a national poet really is a Romantic idea that began in the Romantic period. What is the Romantic period? It's approximately the century between the middle of the 18th century and the middle of the 19th century. So 1750 to 1850. You can dispute this. We'll talk about why later on, but more or less this is correct. Shakespeare was a really important figure, even though, of course, he had written earlier than this. He was an important figure at this time because he provided a kind of model for holding up and saying, look, we modern people can do just as good as the Greeks and Romans could 1,000 years before. So that's why we have this idea of basically Pushkin being the Russian Shakespeare, or Goethe being the German Shakespeare, or Whitman being the American Shakespeare, which is tricky because it's the same language, but you get the idea. Abai being the Kazakh Shakespeare, and so on. The idea of the national poet. By the way, it's not all a boys' game. I always like to show a picture of Lydia Koidula, who was the Estonian national poet, and back in the old days used to be on the money and has lots of statues and such and stamps in Estonia. Okay, so the Romantics really are at the beginning of our idea of modern national literatures, and that's why they're cool to study if you are in Kazakhstan. Okay, so we looked at the dates of the Romantic period, 1750 to 1850, and let's just talk about some of the basic features of the era. Okay, the first is that it was an era of rebellion aesthetically. The previous era in European cultural history, which was the wealthiest and most developed part of the world at the time, was called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is where we get our modern scientific method and ideas about science and reason. The Enlightenment thinkers, they took the sun as their symbol. Therefore, the Romantics who rebelled against them took the moon as their symbol. And we all sort of understand instinctively that the moon is a romantic thing. Um, what did they do? How did they rebel? By celebrating the dark side of life, quote unquote, passion, emotion, imagination, sexuality, wild and dangerous nature, childhood, all that stuff that is irrational, that belongs to the realm of feelings and emotions. And in that process of celebrating those values, they gave us our ideas of what it means to be romantic. Of course, the Romantics were people like anybody else, and they were living through a historical era. We human beings, we're social creatures, we're political creatures. And as the Romantic moon rose, so to speak, it followed the course of events at the time, the course of political events. And it happened to be a very revolutionary time in which modern liberal or social democracies, depending on how you define it, began to replace feudal aristocracies and monarchies. So this really began with the American Revolution in 1776, smack in the middle of the Romantic period, and the French Revolution and its aftermath, which started around 1789, the era of revolution. So this political stuff influenced and shaped Romantic poetry. The other thing we associate with the Romantics is a different kind of revolution, and that's not economic or political, but industrial and economic. And the Romantics were really the first writers in the Western tradition, since Greece and Rome, to really develop a kind of critical attitude towards science and technology. It never would have occurred to previous generations that reason could be anything but good. It was only the Romantics who began to see what you might call the negative sides of too much science, too much technology. A good example is Frankenstein, an example everyone knows. That's one of the great Romantic novels, great Romantic era novels of that era. And it's about the mad scientist who builds a human being and creates all these unforeseen negative consequences. So by celebrating the opposite values to science and reason, things like childhood and wild nature and sexuality and imagination, they introduced a lot of the main themes that make modern literature feel modern. And you can really feel the difference if you compare something written before the Romantic era with something written after the Romantic era, because there's a different sense of values that we associate really with modern values. So they're at the beginning of modern literature. Okay, now you really got to keep an eye on the time, but it shouldn't be too hard to go through the English Romantics. Basically, you can divide the English Romantic poets into two generations. The oldest generation is the one that lived through the French Revolution, that was actually grown up or adult during the French Revolution. And the second generation is the ones that were born during or after the French Revolution, so didn't have any really adult experience with it. You can choose three from each generation to be representative. Of course, there's more than that, but there's sort of three big influencers from each generation that you need to know for as far as the English Romantics are concerned. The first one is William Blake. He's the oldest of them, and in a lot of ways, he's the most radical of all the Romantics. He was an artist, professional illustrator and artist, and he self-published his poetry by inscribing it into hand-illustrated books. So he actually printed these books on his own with his own printing system and sold them as self-publication. So he was a little bit like somebody today with an Instagram account or a YouTube account who's self-publishing his work. The first of the books that he did this way was called Songs of Innocence and Experience, and it was written really through the height of the French Revolution. And it's a good place to start thinking about Romantics and their values. Okay, I'm going to move faster because I'm running out of time. For example, the Songs of Innocence and the Lamb, which is a song about the world seen from a child's perspective, the Song of Experience and the Tiger, which is about the world seen from an adult's perspective. And those two things, what's the difference between innocence and experience, are thematizing a lot of the things that will become important to the Romantics. So he's a really good place to start with the Romantic movement. The most famous in the first generation, however, was Wordsworth. Blake was not very well known in his own day, but Wordsworth was actually quite famous in his own time and probably the most influential poet in the first generation. He was a nature lover as opposed to city and culture. And probably the best way to think about Wordsworth is that he tried to make English poetry sound as natural as possible. So he was really important in making English poetry sound natural. He had a collaborator whose name was Coleridge, Samuel Taylor. Coleridge was a little bit more drawn towards fantastic and exotic themes. He had a bad opium addiction, and his most famous poem, although probably not his best poem, is actually supposedly set in Central Asia, although actually it was a result of a drug experience. It's a famous story from English Romanticism. He was also an important theorist of the movement. Okay, let's look at the second generation, Lord Byron. So as you can see from the date of his birth, he would not have known anything about the French Revolution because he was born right at the time it began. But he was the most famous poet in Europe during the Romantic period. He had a huge following, even bigger than Goethe. And he created the model of the romantic adventurer rebel, the Byronic hero. Okay, you can see this, for example, in Geroj naszego времени of Lermontov. He influenced a lot of poets. There's a famous story about Byron and Shelley. It's the origin of the novel Frankenstein, in which there was a ghost storytelling contest, and Mary Shelley told the story that later became Frankenstein. Speaking of Shelleys, Percy Shelley was married to Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. Percy Shelley is kind of the model of what we would call a woke poet today. In other words, he was a young, progressive idealist, what would you call, activist, vegetarian. And he was one of these people who really believed that he could change the world with his poetry. He's most famous for saying, "Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world." Actually, one of the things he's famous for. But if you're the kind of poet who believes that poetry can change the world, Shelley is your model. He's kind of the model for that in English literature. And the last figure in the second generation was John Keats. He was the youngest of them, last born and first to die. Even Blake outlived him. He was not rich enough to run in the same circles with Byron and Shelley, both of whom were very rich. However, when he died of tuberculosis at the age of 25, Shelley helped to make him famous with an elegy. Keats is the model of, in English, of the kind of poet who articulates the hopes and dreams of youth and then dies tragically young. So if you think about Kurt Cobain or Amy Winehouse or Jimi Hendrix or Victor Tsoi even, the 27 Club types, he's the sort of model for that romantic character type. Okay, so I have been rushing a little bit in the end because I absolutely do not want to mess up the YouTube thing, but let me just talk a little bit before I end about late romanticisms, because that's what the next screencast will be about, namely Romanticism when it came to America and Russia. It was somewhat later, or considerably later actually, than when it happened in Germany or England, but there were a lot of common themes. The most famous American romantic poem, of course, is The Raven, but we also have stories like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which has the Headless Horseman in it, and which has not quite a bit of resemblance with, for example, Yevgeny Sadnik in Russian poetry. Okay, that's it. I'm going to stop the share. My daughter is bothering me, so I'm going to stop, and we will do the next one. Bye.